The most dangerous witness in the room wasn't the man gasping for air on the floor or the neighbors peering through their frosted windows. It was a small plastic tracker strapped to a cold wrist. While Richard Dabate sat zip-tied to a kitchen chair, spinning a cinematic tale of a hulking masked intruder and a desperate struggle for survival, the digital pulse of his wife, Connie, was silently screaming the truth from beyond the veil. He spoke of a camouflage man who brought chaos to their quiet Connecticut home. But the data told a story of a calculated, cold-blooded execution. Every step Connie took in those final minutes was logged, a rhythmic electronic diary of a woman who was supposedly already dead. It was a collision between a prehistoric lie and 21st century precision. And in the end, the machine would prove far more loyal than the husband. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. To understand the magnitude of the betrayal that shattered the town of Ellington, one must first look at the polished, enviable veneer of the life Connie and Richard Dabate had constructed over more than a decade. They were the quintessential suburban success story, a couple that seemed to have mastered the delicate balance of professional ambition and family devotion. Connie, born Concetta Marie Margota, was the heartbeat of their home, a woman whose energy was described by those who knew her as both grounding and infectious. She was a dedicated pharmaceutical representative, a role that required not only a sharp mind but a level of charisma that made her a favorite among her clients and colleagues. Her life was a meticulously managed calendar of school events, fitness classes, and career milestones, all handled with a grace that left her peers in awe. Richard, or Rick as he was known to the community, presented himself as the perfect partner to this powerhouse of a woman. A computer network administrator by trade, he was the tech-savvy, reliable figure who anchored the family's digital and domestic lives. He was the man neighbors saw mowing the lawn, the father who cheered the loudest at his son's soccer games, and the husband who never missed an opportunity to publicly praise his wife. To the outside world, the Dabates' four-bedroom colonial on Birchview Drive wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary of stability in an increasingly chaotic world. They had two young sons who were the center of their universe, and every holiday card or social media update reinforced the image of a family that was not only thriving but genuinely happy. The roots of their relationship stretched back to their youth in Connecticut, a bond forged in the shared values of their upbringing. They had married in 2003, and for many years, the trajectory of their lives followed the classic American trajectory of upward mobility. Connie's career was flourishing, providing the financial backbone that allowed for a comfortable middle-class existence, while Richard's role in IT provided a steady, respectable income. They were active in their local church and deeply embedded in the social fabric of Ellington, a town where nothing ever happens, and doors were often left unlocked. Connie was particularly known for her commitment to her health, often spending her early mornings at the local YMCA, a habit that would ironically become a central pillar of the investigation into her death. However, as any architect of a lie knows, the more beautiful the facade, the harder it is to maintain when the foundation begins to rot. While Connie was moving through her days with the genuine belief that she was building a legacy for her children, Richard was increasingly living in a parallel reality, one defined by secrecy, mounting financial pressure, and a profound sense of inadequacy. The professional gap between them was widening. Connie's success was visible and celebrated, while Richard felt stifled in a career that didn't offer the same accolades or financial rewards. This disparity began to bleed into their private life, creating a silent tension that Richard chose to manage not through communication, but through a series of increasingly reckless personal choices. To his friends at the gym or his co-workers, Richard was still the jovial, supportive, good guy. He possessed a particular kind of suburban charm, a way of speaking that made him seem transparent and vulnerable, which shielded him from suspicion for years. He was the man who would help a neighbor with a computer glitch or offer a kind word during a rough patch, all while his own internal world was spiraling toward a catastrophic breaking point. This duality is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Dabate story, the ability of a person to maintain a routine of normalcy, to kiss their spouse and tuck in their children, while simultaneously harboring secrets that would eventually require a violent resolution. The biography of the Dabate family is a study in the curated life. In the years leading up to 2015, their public existence was a highlight reel of birthdays, vacations, and home improvements. Connie's journals, later discovered by investigators, hinted at a woman who was trying to keep her marriage on track, practicing positive reinforcement and seeking ways to reconnect with the husband she felt was drifting. She remained the optimist, the one who believed that any obstacle could be overcome with enough effort and faith. Richard, meanwhile, was treating their life like a failing software system, searching for a backdoor or a plan B that would allow him to escape the pressures of his own making without losing the status he so desperately craved. By late 2015, the pressure had reached a fever pitch. The community still saw the golden couple, but behind the scenes, the golden boy of Ellington was drowning. The contrast between the woman Connie actually was, a vibrant, loving, and unsuspecting mother, and the version of her Richard would later try to sell to the police is staggering. To understand Connie is to understand the tragedy of a life cut short just as she was reaching her prime. Anchored by a man who saw her not as a partner, but as an obstacle to a new, secret life he was already beginning to inhabit. The stage was set for a collision between Connie's reality and Richard's fantasy, a conflict that would leave 2 children without a mother and a town forever wary of the perfect neighbor. While the community of Ellington saw a marriage made of granite, the internal structure of the Dabate household had become a fragile lattice of lies and mounting desperation. By 2015, Richard was no longer just a husband and father. He was a man performing a role while his actual life was being lived in the shadows of encrypted messages and secret rendezvous. The primary fissure in their perfect life was a secret so profound it rendered the couple's upcoming Christmas celebrations a hollow charade. Richard had a mistress, and she was pregnant. This wasn't a fleeting indiscretion or a momentary lapse in judgment. Richard had been engaged in a long-term extramarital affair with a woman named Sarah Ward. He had successfully compartmentalized this relationship for a significant period, but nature eventually forced his hand. When Sarah became pregnant, the theoretical world of Richard's double life collided violently with physical reality. He was now a man standing between 2 irreconcilable futures. On one side was Connie, the woman who provided his social standing, his beautiful home, and the mother of his 2 sons. On the other was a new life that required him to abandon everything he had spent a decade building. The psychological toll on Richard during this period was immense, though he remained an expert at masking it. He began to spin a narrative for Sarah that mirrored the lies he would later tell the police, a story where he was the victim of circumstance. He told his mistress that he and Connie were on the verge of divorce, that they were merely coexisting for the sake of the children, and that he was actively working on an exit strategy. In reality, Connie was completely unaware of the impending collapse. Her journals from this period showed a woman focused on improving her marriage, seemingly believing that any distance she felt from Richard was merely the result of their busy professional lives. She was trying to fix a bond that her husband had already severed in his mind. Financial pressures acted as a secondary catalyst, accelerating the rot within the foundation. Despite Connie's lucrative career in pharmaceuticals, the couple's lifestyle was expensive, and Richard's own financial contributions were stagnant. Investigators later discovered that Richard had been siphoning money from their joint accounts to fund his life with Sarah and to prepare for a Plan B that he never quite had the courage to execute through legal means. The weight of supporting 2 households, one real and one burgeoning in secret, was beginning to crush him. He was a man who craved the respect of his peers, and a messy, public divorce involving an illegitimate child and financial ruin was a humiliation he couldn't abide. Richard's computer administrator background allowed him to navigate this digital deception with a level of sophistication that Connie couldn't match. He used his technical skills to monitor his own digital trail and, eventually, to keep tabs on Connie's movements. He was a man who lived in data, and he believed he could manipulate that data to protect himself. He began researching how to commit the perfect crime and looked into life insurance policies, though he did so under the guise of standard family planning. The Plan B he had mentioned to Sarah was beginning to morph from a divorce into something much more permanent and dark. The dichotomy of his existence during the final months of 2015 was chilling. He would spend his weekends at soccer games and holiday parties, smiling for photos and playing the part of the devoted suburban dad, only to retreat into his basement office to exchange frantic, high-stakes messages with Sarah about their future. He was a man running out of time. Sarah was beginning to demand clarity. She wanted to know when he was going to tell Connie, when they were going to start their life together, and how he intended to support their child. Richard was being squeezed from both sides, and the pressure was stripping away the last of his moral inhibitions. In the weeks leading up to December, Richard's behavior became increasingly erratic, though only in retrospect. He was obsessive about their home security system, frequently checking the logs and testing the sensors. He talked more often about the dangers of their neighborhood, perhaps planting the seeds for a narrative involving a home invasion. He was creating a world where a phantom threat existed, a convenient bogeyman that could be blamed for any tragedy that might occur. Connie, ever the pragmatist, seemed to dismiss these concerns as Richard's typical technical obsessiveness, never dreaming that the system meant to protect her was being studied as a tool for her demise. The psychological profile of Richard Dabate is one of extreme narcissism combined with a profound fear of failure. He couldn't be the man who failed his marriage, nor could he be the man who abandoned his pregnant mistress. He needed a solution that allowed him to remain the hero of his own story, a grieving widower who had fought valiantly against an intruder, rather than a disgraced husband who had destroyed his family. He viewed Connie not as a human being with whom he shared a life, but as a liability that needed to be liquidated. As the Christmas of 2015 approached, Richard had stopped looking for a way out of his marriage and started looking for a way to erase the woman who stood in the way of his new beginning. The cracks in the porcelain were no longer just superficial. The entire structure was waiting for a single violent blow to bring it all down. The morning of December 23, 2015, in Ellington, Connecticut, began with the deceptive quiet of a suburban winter. The air was biting, and the Dabate household on Birchview Drive was stirring with the typical, albeit slightly frantic, energy of a family preparing for the Christmas holiday. This was meant to be a day of final errands and festive anticipation, but for Connie Dabate, it would become a chronological map of her final moments, a map etched into the silicon of the device strapped to her wrist. Richard's version of that morning, which he would later recount to investigators with cinematic flair, painted a picture of a sudden, violent home invasion. He claimed he had left the house around 7:30 a.m. to head to work, only to realize he had forgotten his laptop. According to his statement, he returned home shortly after 9 a.m. to find a hulking intruder in the house. A man roughly 6 feet 2 inches tall, dressed in camouflage and a mask, possessing a voice that Richard described as deep and Vin Diesel-like. Richard alleged that this intruder had chased him through the house, eventually cornering him and Connie, who had just returned from her morning fitness class at the YMCA. In Richard's narrative, the intruder was a phantom of pure malice. He claimed the camouflage man had wrestled him into a chair, zip-tying his hands and feet before turning a weapon on Connie. Richard described hearing the chilling sound of a struggle in the basement, followed by a single, devastating gunshot. He claimed he had managed to fight back, eventually using a torch to burn the intruder, forcing the massive man to flee into the woods behind their home. It was a story of a husband's desperate, failed heroism, a tale designed to evoke sympathy and redirect the gaze of justice toward the surrounding forest. However, the digital reality of December 23rd was far less theatrical and infinitely more damning. The investigation would later reveal that the timeline Richard provided was not just inaccurate, it was physically impossible. The ghost in the machine, Connie's Fitbit, began to speak for her long after her voice had been silenced. While Richard claimed Connie had been chased and murdered shortly after 9 a.m., the data from her fitness tracker showed she was still moving, walking, and active until 10:05 a.m. This nearly hour-long discrepancy was the first major crack in Richard's facade. As Connie returned from her 9 a.m. spin class at the YMCA, her movements were rhythmic and ordinary. She pulled into the driveway at 9:18 a.m., her mind likely on the day's to-do list. The home security system logged her entry into the house at 9:23 a.m. For the next 40 minutes, Connie moved about her home. The Fitbit recorded her taking steps, moving from room to room and eventually heading toward the basement. There was no sign of a struggle, no frantic spike in heart rate that would indicate she was being pursued by a masked giant. She was simply a woman at home, unaware that the person she trusted most was waiting for her with a .357 Ruger. While Connie was moving through the house, Richard's own digital footprint was becoming increasingly erratic. He was logged into his work email from the home computer at 9:04 a.m., sending a message to his supervisor claiming he was heading out after a delay. But he never left. Instead, he remained in the house, watching and waiting. The internal sensors of the home security system recorded movement in the basement at the exact time Connie descended the stairs. At 10:05 a.m., Connie's Fitbit recorded its final, singular burst of movement, a frantic 1,217 feet of distance covered in a short span, followed by absolute digital silence. The reconstruction of the shooting itself suggests a cold, calculated execution rather than a chaotic struggle. Connie was found in the basement, shot in the back and head. The trajectory of the bullets and the lack of defensive wounds indicated she never saw it coming. She had been hunted in her own home by a man who had spent the morning crafting an alibi on his laptop while she was at the gym. Richard had utilized his knowledge of their home's dead zones and security lag times, but he had forgotten one crucial variable: the wearable technology Connie never took off. After the shots were fired, the timeline became a frantic attempt by Richard to stage a crime scene. He had to transform a murder into a home invasion. He began the process of shuffling the house, toppling chairs, opening drawers, and creating the appearance of a struggle. He then zip-tied himself to a folding chair in the kitchen, carefully tightening the plastic strips just enough to appear restrained but loosely enough to maintain circulation. To add a layer of authenticity, he used a small butane torch to singe his own skin and clothing, hoping the marks would corroborate his story of a fiery confrontation with the camouflage man. At 10:11 a.m., Richard triggered the home's panic alarm. It was the signal for the final act of his play. He waited for the police to arrive, rehearsing the voice of the Vin Diesel intruder in his head, preparing to play the role of the traumatized survivor. When the first officers arrived on the scene, they found Richard on the floor, moaning for help, claiming his wife was in the basement and that the killer had just disappeared into the trees. He pointed toward the woods with a trembling hand, unaware that the device on Connie's wrist had already recorded his betrayal in a language of unalterable code. The Day X of the Dabate family was not a story of an intruder's cruelty, but of a husband's ultimate selfishness. Richard had gambled that his narrative would be stronger than the facts, that a grieving husband would never be scrutinized as closely as a masked stranger. He had spent months living in a world of secret pregnancies and financial siphoning, and on December 23rd, he decided to delete the one person who anchored him to a reality he no longer wanted. But as the sun rose over the snow-dusted Ellington landscape, the digital evidence was already beginning to weave a noose around the man who thought he could outsmart the truth. The silence in the basement was profound, but the data was just beginning to scream. When the first sirens began to wail through the crisp December air of Ellington, they carried with them the frantic urgency of a community's shattered peace. The police officers who turned onto Birchview Drive at approximately 10:16 a.m. were responding to a high-priority panic alarm, a signal that usually meant a medical emergency or a residential intrusion. What they found instead was a scene that felt ripped from the pages of a high-stakes thriller, yet possessed an underlying quality of artifice that some seasoned responders found immediately unsettling. The first officer through the door was met with the acrid, lingering scent of smoke, not the smell of a cozy hearth, but the sharp, chemical odor of scorched fabric and singed hair. In the kitchen, the sight was jarring. Richard Dabate was on the floor, still partially attached to a folding chair. He appeared to be a man who had barely survived a war zone. His clothing was torn and blackened in places, and he was vocalizing a rhythmic, guttural moan of distress. Plastic zip ties were looped around one of his wrists and ankles. Though even in those initial seconds, the responders noted a curious detail. The restraints were not tight enough to indent the skin or cut off circulation. Richard's hands were remarkably steady for a man who had allegedly just fought a giant. As paramedics began to assess Richard, his words tumbled out in a breathless, staccato rush. He pointed frantically toward the back of the house, toward the dense line of trees that buffered the property. He spoke of the camouflage man, a hulking, masked figure who had invaded their sanctuary, tortured him with a torch, and then disappeared into the winter woods. He pleaded with the officers to check the basement, his voice cracking as he whispered Connie's name. The theatricality of his delivery was intense. He played the role of the broken hero to the hilt, his eyes darting toward the exits as if he expected the Phantom to return at any moment. While one team stayed with Richard, a second group of officers descended into the basement. The temperature dropped as they moved away from the warmth of the kitchen, the silence of the lower level feeling heavy and suffocating. At the bottom of the stairs, the reality of the morning took its most brutal form. Connie Dabate lay on the concrete floor, her body still and small in the expansive, shadowed room. She was dressed in her gym clothes, the vibrant colors of her workout gear a haunting contrast to the gray environment. There were no signs of a struggle in the room, no overturned shelves or scuffed floors. It looked like an execution. The single bullet wound to her head and another to her back told a story of a woman who had been targeted with clinical precision. The paramedics quickly confirmed what the officers already sensed. Connie was gone. The discovery of the body shifted the energy of the scene from a rescue mission to a manhunt. Outside, the quiet suburb was transformed into a tactical command center. K-9 units were deployed, their barks echoing through the neighborhood as they began to sniff the perimeter for the scent of a 6'2" intruder in camouflage. State police helicopters hovered low over the Ellington woods, their thermal imaging cameras scanning the underbrush for the heat signature of a fleeing man. Officers established a perimeter, knocking on the doors of neighbors who were just beginning to set up their Christmas decorations. The community reaction was immediate and visceral. In a town like Ellington, the idea of a masked intruder stalking the woods was a nightmare made manifest. Parents called their children inside, locking doors that had remained open for decades. Rumors began to spread like wildfire through local group chats and social media. A killer on the loose, a targeted hit, a random act of violence. The fear was palpable. A cold fog that settled over the town as people watched the golden boy of Birchview Drive being loaded into an ambulance, his face a mask of grief and exhaustion. Yet, amidst the chaos of the search, the lead investigators were already noticing the glitches in Richard's narrative. As they walked the perimeter of the property, they found no footprints in the light dusting of snow that should have been left by a 250-pound man fleeing at high speed. The dogs, trained to track human scent, showed zero interest in the woods Richard had pointed to. Instead, they paced nervously around the house itself. Inside the garage, officers found Richard's lost laptop neatly tucked away and his wallet, items a robber would typically seize. The physical evidence within the house also began to tell a contradictory story. The struggle Richard described had left him with remarkably superficial injuries. minor singe marks that looked more like self-inflicted burns than the results of a torture session. The zip ties he claimed were forced upon him by a hulking stranger were found to be from a package already inside the home, and the way they were fastened suggested a person who had applied them to themselves while seated. Most glaringly, the basement door showed no signs of forced entry. The camouflage man seemed to have the ability to move through walls without leaving a trace. By the time the sun began to set on December 23rd, the massive manhunt was quietly being scaled back. The phantom in the woods remained a ghost, and the detectives' focus began to drift away from the trees and back toward the man in the hospital bed. They saw the way Richard's trauma seemed to vanish whenever he thought he wasn't being observed, only to return with redoubled intensity when a nurse or officer entered the room. The initial scene was a masterpiece of suburban noir, but the search had yielded nothing but a profound digital silence. The investigation was about to pivot from the physical world of footprints and sightings to the invisible world of data, a world where Richard Dabate's lies would have no place to hide. As the physical search for the camouflage man yielded nothing but empty woods and frustrated K-9 units, the investigators of the Connecticut State Police Western District Major Crime Squad turned their attention inward. They stopped looking at the horizon and started looking at the silicon. Richard Dabate had spent his career as a computer network administrator, a man who lived in the world of routers, IP addresses, and encrypted logs. He likely believed he was the smartest person in any room involving technology, but he had committed a fatal error. He underestimated the loyalty of the devices he had integrated into his family's daily life. The digital inquest began with the heart of the case, the Fitbit Alta found on Connie's wrist. To a layman, it was a simple fitness tracker. To the detectives, it was a black box flight recorder of her final hour. When forensic analysts synced the device, the data it spit out was nothing short of a digital scream from the grave. Richard's narrative required Connie to be dead or incapacitated shortly after 9 a.m. to fit the timeline of his heroic struggle. However, the Fitbit recorded Connie's heart beating and her legs moving with casual regularity until 10:05 a.m. It showed her traveling 1,217 feet within the house during a period when Richard claimed she was being held at gunpoint or already murdered in the basement. The device didn't just contradict him, it rendered his entire camouflage man story a physical impossibility, but the Fitbit was only the first witness to testify against him. The investigators widened their digital net, sweeping up data from every connected corner of the house. They turned to the home's security system, a sophisticated array of sensors and alarms that Richard himself had managed. The logs showed that the garage door opened at 9:18 a.m., marking Connie's return from the YMCA. More importantly, the internal motion sensors told a story of isolation, not intrusion. From 9 a.m. until the panic alarm was triggered at 10:11 a.m., only 2 people were detected moving inside the residence. There were no sensors triggered in the escape routes Richard described. No door opened to allow a 250-pound giant to vanish into the trees. The house was a sealed tomb, and the only other living soul inside was Richard. The deeper the detectives delved into the digital architecture of Richard's life, the more the golden boy persona dissolved into a mess of high-stakes desperation. His work computer, which he claimed to be using at the office, revealed he had been logged in from his home IP address the entire morning. He had been sending emails to his boss at 9:04 a.m., meticulously crafting a digital paper trail to place himself elsewhere, unaware that the metadata was tethering him directly to the scene of the crime. Even more damning were his Facebook logs. At 9:40 a.m., a time when Richard claimed he was zip-tied to a chair fighting for his life, his account was active, browsing the social media platform from a device inside the house. Then came the financial and personal metadata. Investigators found that Richard had been siphoning money into secret accounts and, perhaps most critically, they discovered the secret pregnancy of Sarah Ward. They found the text messages where Richard promised his mistress that a divorce was imminent, that he was working on Plan B, and that they would be together soon. The digital inquest had uncovered a motive far more ancient than a random robbery. A man desperate to erase his current life to fund a new one without the social or financial stain of a public divorce. As the state police presented these findings, the social echo in Ellington began to shift. The initial wave of terror that had gripped the town, the fear of a masked killer in the woods, was replaced by a chilling realization that the monster had been among them all along. Neighbors who had initially offered Richard soup and sympathy now looked at the Colonial on Birchview Drive with a sense of profound betrayal. The red herrings Richard had scattered, the mention of Vin Diesel voices and burning torches were seen for what they were, the frantic, cinematic improvisations of a guilty man. The investigation was no longer about a manhunt. It was about the meticulous reconstruction of a digital timeline that left Richard with 0 seconds of unaccounted for time. Every step Connie took was a mark against him. Every email he sent was a link in his own shackles. The technical precision of the case was groundbreaking, marking one of the first times in American legal history that a wearable device would serve as the primary witness in a murder trial. Richard had built a digital world to support his lies, but in the end, it was that same world that provided the truth he couldn't delete. The legal road to justice for Connie Dabate was a marathon of technical scrutiny and emotional endurance that stretched nearly 7 years after that snowy December morning. Despite the overwhelming digital evidence, Richard remained free on a $1 million bond, maintaining his innocence while the community of Ellington watched in a state of suspended disbelief. The trial, delayed by the complexities of forensic data and a global pandemic, finally commenced in April 2022. The courtroom became a theater of high-tech testimony, where the ghost in the machine finally took the stand. Prosecutors systematically dismantled Richard's camouflage man defense by pitting his words against the unyielding logs of the Fitbit and the home security system. They presented the testimony of Sarah Ward, the mistress whose pregnancy provided the desperate motive for the Plan B Richard had so chillingly executed. The defense attempted to paint Richard as a victim of a sophisticated intruder who somehow bypassed every sensor in the home. But the argument withered under the weight of the metadata. On May 10, 2022, after only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: murder, tampering with physical evidence, and making a false statement to authorities. In August of that year, Richard was sentenced to 65 years in prison. The man who thought he could outsmart the truth with a laptop was led away in shackles, destined to spend the rest of his life in a cell, haunted by the digital heartbeat of the woman he tried to erase. The silence in the Dabate home was finally replaced by the cold, impartial weight of justice. Richard tried to drown the truth in a sea of cinematic lies, but he forgot that we live in an era where our ghosts are digital. Connie's Fitbit didn't just track her steps, it carried her voice to the jury box, proving that a machine's memory is often more honest than a husband's heart. In the end, the camouflage man was nothing more than a reflection in a dark screen, and Richard Dabate's legacy is now a cautionary tale of the data we leave behind. If you are finished watching, you're a real true crime fan. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. See you in the next video.